In this video, we're going to take a look at the hidden abilities of all of the perks in Black Ops 6 Zombies. I'll also be including their base abilities, so if you're new to the game and you want to just learn what the perks do, the info is in this video, but there's also extra info that isn't described in the game's menus or elsewhere, which makes some of these perks even more powerful, or in some cases less powerful, than you might expect. The first perk on our list is Stamina Up, and its description says it increases movement speed. The question is, by how much? First, to test this, I created a little 100-meter sprint for myself in the spawn of Terminus. And this is what it looks like comparing the with Stamina Up footage to the without Stamina Up footage. Interestingly, a lot of the animations feel a lot faster when you're running with Stamina Up, but your actual character speed isn't changing as much as it visually appears. And if we run the calculation here of how much faster Stam was, it was only 5%. However, that was just the 100-meter sprint, so next, let's test something a bit longer distance. That way, it will average out a lot of the potential inconsistencies or room for error that you might see in a sprint that is so short. So we're going to run along this line in Liberty Falls, and we're going to test both tack sprinting, and we're going to do it not tack sprinting. And when we run the numbers here, it turns out that the increased stamina up speed is actually between 9% and 10.3%. And I would trust this a little bit more than the super short distance because, like I said, it's going to average out those inconsistencies. And I think what happens in the short sprint is that tack sprint doesn't necessarily kick in at the exact same time every time you start sprinting. And so that can add essentially some systematic error to the measurement. But in a longer sprint, that error is a much smaller percentage of the overall sprint. And so it throws our calculation off much less. So stamina up, approximately 10% speed boost. Our next perk on the list is Speed Cola. As I'm sure you could probably guess, Speed Cola increases your reload speed. And the game's description says it does so by 30%. However, in my testing, this wasn't actually the case. So I tested this by using the same weapon in the same game, using up the same amount of ammo from its magazine, and then reloading it, and looking frame by frame to see when it was done with the animation. And the challenge with this is that sometimes the animation is finished, but you still can't actually fire the weapon. And that, I think, is where some of the discrepancies come in with Speed Cola, because it aims for 30%, I think, but sometimes it's actually a little slower. In one test, for example, it was only a 22% increase. However, there's a hidden bonus that comes with Speed Cola, which is incredible, and that's that it increases your armor replating speed as well. And while the game thinks that it's only doing this by 30%, if you actually run the numbers on a single replate instead of replating multiple plates at once, I found that it actually increased the replating speed by 127%. In other words, it was about 2.3 times faster to replate with speed than without. And I think this comes from the fact that when you're doing multiple replates, there's a little bit of a delay between each replate, and that varies with speed and without. But no matter how you slice it, Speed Cola gives a massive boost to replating, which is incredibly useful. Next on our list is Quick Revive. And in the past, Quick Revive just reduced the time it would take to revive an ally who was downed, and it would do so by about 50%. And that remains true in Black Ops 6. You'll have double your revive speed, and that'll make it a lot easier to get your friends up. But since Black Ops 4, Treyarch have also implemented this faster regen thing with Quick Revive, and in Black Ops 6, it works in the following way. Every time you take damage, let's say you get knocked down to 50 HP, there will be a delay between you taking that last hit of damage to 50 HP and you starting to regen your health. And then there'll also be some amount of time that it takes you to regen all the health. It doesn't just happen straight away. So that's two separate stats we need to pay attention to. The first is regen delay, where you just stay at the low health for that period, and the second is your actual regen speed once you start regenning. And what Quick Revive does is it reduces the regen delay, so that first number, by 50%, and in my testing, this was actually exactly 50%. And if we convert that into actual time, that means that instead of spending 6 seconds waiting for your health to start regenning, you only have to wait for 3 seconds. But the key detail here that a lot of people get mixed up with is that it does not make you quickly revive your own health, in the sense that you don't regen any faster once you start regenning. The actual regen speed is the exact same. So to go from 50 HP up to 250 HP, it still takes about a full 2 seconds, regardless of whether or not you have quick revive. Next is Deadshot Daiquiri. The description for this one's usually pretty simple. It helps you get headshots, and it does that by snapping your aim to the critical point on an enemy, which is usually its head. However, in the modern iterations of zombies, Deadshot actually does something else entirely, which is increase your critical damage. To test this, you can quite simply shoot zombies in the head that are stronger than the shot that you're firing, so they survive the shot, and then that'll tell you exactly how much damage you've done in that moment. And then you can simply equip Deadshot Daiquiri, get a headshot again from the same range. That's important because at longer distance, your bullets are going to do less damage. So from the same close quarters distance, shoot the zombie in the head again and compare the damage numbers. And when you do this, you'll see that Deadshot only increases critical damage to a regular zombie by 10%, which feels a little underwhelming to me. Next is Elemental Pop. This one I think is actually fairly straightforward. Every bullet you fire when you have Elemental Pop has a small chance to apply a random ammo mod effect. So it can be any of the ammo mods in the game, and sometimes you'll be shooting for a while and it'll feel like Elemental Pop is almost broken. Like, it just won't trigger over and over and over again, whereas at other times, it seems to be very consistent. And it's quite strange. It seems to be linked, in my experience, to getting kills or doing an amount of damage that would kill a zombie. And if you just totally delete the zombie, like with a shotgun, for instance, it's less likely to trigger your Elemental Pop, whereas if you're spraying with an SMG or something, it might be a bit more likely to trigger, especially if you're getting a lot of collaterals when you do so. And so, because of that, I'd say that it's a little unreliable, but because of the fact that it just does what it says on the tin, I think it actually kind of counts as one of the simplest perks here. Next is PhD Flopper. Back in the day, this would allow you to take a belly flop off a raised surface, and when you hit the ground, you'd create a massive explosion around you. And you'd also no longer take any full damage, and you'd no longer take any explosive damage. So if you had a Mustang and Sally, or if you had a ray gun, for instance, you'd no longer need to worry about splash damage hurting you because you had PhD Flopper. And these days, it's slightly different. So the fall damage immunity is specifically while diving to prone. And this one's kind of funny because it's actually quite hard to trigger diving to prone fall damage when you don't have PhD Flopper, unless you're jumping from such a great height that you're obviously gonna die. Like in the example clip here, I'm trying my best to damage myself without PhD, and I take 2 full damage. So it's not really a big deal. Now, on top of that, the modern version of PhD doesn't make you immune to all explosive damage. Instead, it's specifically all self-inflicted damage and status effects. But that does not mean that you should suddenly become immune to all the status effects that enemies might be able to inflict on you. The nice thing about PhD nowadays as well is that the explosion damage increases the higher you fall from. So if you flop from a really crazy height, you're going to do a crazy amount of damage, and it's going to be effective into later rounds. Next is Juggernog, and this one's actually the simplest on the list. I said it was Elemental Pop, but no, it's Juggernog, because Jug increases your health. How much by? Well, 100. And what that means in terms of zombie hits actually varies in modern Call of Duty Zombies titles like Cold War and Black Ops 6. So at lower rounds, that's going to add around 5 or maybe 6 hits to your character. So you're going to become much more tanky buying Jug early. But later in the game, round 50, for example, zombies hit you for more damage. And so that 100 HP is only going to be enough to survive or sustain maybe 2 hits or 3 hits instead of 5 or 6. There's not really anything else that it completely changes or secretly does though, so Jug's nice and simple. And next is the new perk, Melee Macchiato. This gives you a Thunder Punch, kind of like we saw in Origins with the Thunder Fists, and that Thunder Punch does increased damage compared to your regular gun butt, which is the version of Melee that we have these days. However, there's some interesting quirks with this. So the Thunder Punch that you get from Melee Macchiato is quite slow. It only hits one zombie at a time unless you augment it, and it doesn't infinitely one-hit kill, which is a little disappointing. For example, here's a clip of me at round 21, and it's taking 2 melees. So Melee Macchiato is not the be-all, end-all, melee-only solution. Like, it can't do that on its own, but it can add to ways you might otherwise build a melee build. So the way I'd recommend using Melee Macchiato is not using the deadly punch, as Treyarch calls it, that replaces your weapon gun butt, despite the fact that that is the main benefit of the perk. Instead, we're going to make use of the fact that it secretly buffs other melee weapons that you can carry as well. And you spawn in with a dedicated melee weapon. So, for instance, the knife, normally at Grey Rarity, is going to cap out at one-hit killing pretty damn early in your game. For example, here I am on round 8, having to gunbutt my enemies 4 times and knife them twice. But with Melee Macchiato, your dedicated melee weapon is also stronger, and so if you combine that with rarity upgrades, that's how you can create the most powerful melee build. And that will quickly exceed the damage that you can create by just doing the vicious punch that replaces the gun butt. And you can even add ammo mods to your dedicated melee weapons and stuff as well. If this was useful, I bet you'll love these tips I wish I knew sooner about Black Ops 6 Zombies. It's linked on the screen right now. Give it a click, and I'll see you there.